Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to wait a couple minutes for others to join and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we'll just get started now and others can trickle in. My name is Charlotte. I work at Inclusion Canada as a project officer, and I'm happy that you have all joined us this evening to welcome Steve and Tiffany to our webinar on strengthening classrooms by enhancing student roles. Welcome, everyone. Um, as we gather virtually from across the country, I would like to acknowledge the many Indigenous lands we are joining from today. So, from coast to coast to coast, we recognize the territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call these lands home. In our work for inclusive education, we recognize the historical and ongoing impacts of colonization. We are grateful for the opportunity to learn and work together in a spirit of reconciliation. So for the Q&A, this is how I'm going to explain how to ask a question in the Q&A for the webinar this evening. So throughout the presentation, Stephen will share some thought-provoking questions. We invite you to share thoughts and response in the Q&A section so that we can share them with him. So if you go to the bottom of your screen, you should see a function for Q&A. You should also receive an after webinar survey, and we'd love for you to fill it out to help us provide helpful content to you in the future. Over to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Charlotte. So my name is Andrea Cameron. I'm the Executive Director of Inclusive Education Initiatives for Inclusion Canada. I'm also a parent to a young man with a disability, and I've been a teacher for 26 years. So I'd like to welcome teachers, educators, people interested in inclusive education from all across Canada, coast to coast to coast, as we come together to learn how classrooms can be more inclusive. I'd like to acknowledge the extra planning it takes for all of us to come together like this and to learn. It reflects a deep commitment to our students. We manage a lot of moving parts in a classroom and it can be exhausting. This is why educators are notoriously skeptical about who they listen to. Strategies and ideas must directly align with the realities of a learning environment that's required to meet everyone's needs, keep everyone safe, and support everyone to learn. So, our speaker tonight does this. He is a classroom teacher who understands the challenges teachers face. He also understands the challenges of his students and intentionally works to support everyone's full inclusion. I first met Stephen when I was at the Social Role Valorization International Conference in Halifax last spring, and I had the opportunity to hear him speak. As a teacher myself, I was intrigued that he was also a classroom teacher who'd done the important work of understanding and studying social role valorization and that he was applying it to a classroom. What I heard was the story of a learning community that expanded to welcome a student who had been labeled and excluded. I saw the power of one teacher's intention. I was reminded that our students and the wider community look to us to model inclusion. They watch who we welcome and who we value. So you don't need to know anything about social role valorization to appreciate Stephen's message. It's enough to know that this framework is about protecting the value and dignity of the most vulnerable members of our community, and that it's very helpful in creating inclusive classrooms. So, tonight is about the kids who are getting left behind, the kids who weigh on our minds and souls. While there are lots of demands placed on teachers, we are not without power to act, to ask questions, and to advocate for the students who have been told they don't belong. The kids at the door right now can't wait for an imperfect system to be improved. They need us to do this work and to do what we can right now. And yes, this is work. Inclusion is work. Justice is work. But after 26 years in education, I know teachers choose this work and we choose it for the kids. So I'd like to welcome Stephen Tiffany, and just a little bit of information there. He's an elementary teacher living in Kingston, Ontario. He's also worked in the field of human services for 20 years, supporting people in a wide variety of settings. So he's a passionate advocate for students with disabilities and their families. And as I mentioned, he also is a student of social role valorization and shares that knowledge with other educators. So currently, he's teaching grade 2 in a diverse neighborhood where he confronts the challenges of inclusion on a daily basis. So, welcome, Stephen. We're so happy you're here.
Andrea, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm so happy to be here. Yeah, to share kind of part, I guess you'll hear a bit about my story and my journey with inclusion and some of the things that I've been thinking about in the past couple of years of teaching. So yeah, I want to thank everyone who's here tonight, taking time out of their busy schedules to think about this topic that I think is truly really important for all students actually, but especially students with disabilities. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to jump into the presentation. So, in our current reality of budget cuts to special education, dwindling EA support or educational assistance support, and the closures of so-called special classrooms, it can seem like inclusion is possible in name only. Classrooms in Ontario increasingly have more at-risk students than in the past, including students with disabilities, students living in poverty, and students new to Canada lacking English or French proficiency. How can we, as classroom teachers, support inclusion for students with disabilities? As a student of social role valorization, which I'll touch on more in a moment, I've had the benefit of bringing a different mindset to the classroom, one that has allowed me to think constructively about the needs of students with disabilities and plan accordingly for them. So my strategies are not bulletproof solutions to the global problems affecting special education. I would argue, however, that they are effective on an individual classroom level in creating communal environments. In other words, classroom communities that foster inclusion for a wide variety of at-risk students through the promotion of the most important role for young people attending school, that of student. So, through here. So, what qualifies me to speak on the topic of inclusion? So I do have a background, as Andrea said, in developmental services. I've supported throughout the years people with disabilities in a variety of settings. It's including for about a decade working in community living organizations before I became a teacher, including working in day programs and employment service programs, in group homes, and in the community in general. So I think I've seen kind of I have a good perspective, I feel like, on the lives of people with disabilities in the community, even before I became a teacher. And now I've been a public school teacher for about 13 years, including teaching in special education classrooms. And I currently teach grade 2, where I've been teaching primary classes for the past couple of years. I also have 3 children of my own who attend public schools in Kingston. And so finally, and importantly for this presentation, I'm a student and a teacher of social role valorization theory, having attended and then taught an extensive number of courses on the topic over the past 2 decades, all over Ontario. As I'll explain in a moment, social role valorization, or SRV as it is widely known, is a framework for thinking about how to improve the lives of people with disabilities, and I believe it has a wide application in public schools across the country. So I made a similar presentation last year to the International SRV conference in Halifax, which drew the attention of Andrea, who asked me to come speak to you today. So, so before I begin, though, I'll ask you to have an open mind about what you're about to hear. On the one hand, I think many of the ideas I present this evening may be ones you have heard before. On the other hand, some of what I say may run contrary to how you've gone about things, especially if you're a teacher, how you've gone about things in your teaching career. So And this may cause you to reflect on some of your own practices in the classroom, which I understand can be uncomfortable. However, I offer my observations and opinions here not as a criticism of teachers, but to shine a light, I think, on what is possible given the right mindset. So, first of all, since I'll be talking a bit about social role valorization throughout this presentation, what is it? What is it all about? So just a definition. It is the enablement, establishment, enhancement, maintenance, and or defense of valued social roles for people, particularly for people at value risk, by using as much as possible culturally valued means. So I'll jump into a bit about the theory in a little while as well. So it was developed by the scholar Dr. Wolf Wolfensberger, who was a longtime professor in special education at Syracuse University in New York. And he's most famous in Canada for leading the push for deinstitutionalization when he was the director of the National Institute on Mental Retardation in the late 60s and early 70s. That's what the institute was called then. So I was lucky enough, there's a slide here. You can see me in the middle looking much younger, all the way back in 2009. But I was lucky enough to get to teach with him before he passed away. And that, yeah, so it's just like he had a lot to share. And I've taken a lot of what he taught me into my teaching. So I'm not going to be teaching SRV theory specifically, but its language and ideas inform my practice. And so I'll make reference to them and explain them as best as I can here. So I think you'll find in my presentation that I think about the inclusive classroom as a setting for enhancing the roles of students with disabilities, especially the role of student. So what do I mean by student role? So SRV speaks in terms of valued roles. Think about like work roles or student role, volunteer roles, things like that, as the best means for acquiring the good things of life for someone who they say is devalued, or has the potential to be so. So here I'm not like claiming that people are inherently devalued because of their conditions, but I'm more talking about people who are devalued by the wider society around them, by the culture, because of their perceived differences. So as I said, I'll be focusing on the student role in this presentation. So, what is the definition of a student? And do all the students in your classroom fit this role? The Oxford English Dictionary defines a student as a person who is studying at school or at college. But, if you teach in elementary school or high school, you know that there's so much more to the student role than that. It's about engaging in learning activities, both independently, in small groups, with the full group. It's about interactions with teachers, and about having your teacher kind of interact with you, that kind of back and forth with a teacher and a relationship with a teacher is so actually essential to the student role. It's about engaging with your peers in learning and in play. And hopefully, it's about participation in the wider life of a school and a classroom, through extracurriculars or sports or clubs, things like that. Kind of the life of the school. So I'm gonna present you with some questions throughout the presentation, um, kind of as some food for thought. So this is where you can kind of share in the chat some of your thoughts on this if you feel up to it. So I guess based on what I've just said about, this kind of definition of a student role, I guess I'm wondering, are there students in your classroom who are maybe physically present, they're there in the classroom, but maybe not fully inhabiting the student role? And, what might be preventing that?
So we'll just give people a minute to think about that
Yeah.
question. And
Yeah.
if you want to jot down, obviously we'll no identifying information or anything like that, but just sort of some general ideas in relation to the question, or you can just think about it. But we'll still give people a minute, whether they want to write their answer or think about the question, to take the time to do that. And then if we get any responses, we'll share them. And if not, we'll just continue on.
You can just give me a signal, Andrew, when you want me to continue.
Okay. Okay,
Good.
great. Yeah.
Yeah.
While people are writing and thinking, I might just say too something what might be preventing the student role, just if I could make an observation from my own teaching
Hmm.
practice. That you'd mentioned at the end there the extracurricular activities. And as a former drama teacher, that was where so many lifelong friendships were formed.
Hmm.
And I think when students don't have the opportunity to participate in those activities, they miss out on that. And I see my students who, in the past, students with intellectual disabilities in particular who participated in theater, and I see that that's still a big part of their life now in
Hmm.
community.
Hmm.
And so extracurriculars, they thread, as part of the student role, it threads throughout your life. It's not just when you're in school. So it was something that question makes me think of. And I do see we have a question,
Yeah.
or a comment, I guess. Students are too often engaging with educational assistants with less connection to the classroom teacher. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that. And this is kind of similar. I often hear teachers share there is no support, only one teacher and 25 students. So interesting, they're both kind of about support, but one
Yeah.
is the students don't have a chance to interact with the teacher. So maybe you speak to that one first a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. I think I struggle with that. Like I've struggled with that every year, especially in the past like 5 or 6 years in primary. And yeah, like students who need like they need that extra support or that extra support is really key to their participation. But yeah, really I've really thought long and hard about like yeah, the role of an educational assistant and when does it like become kind of just almost like a almost like they're unintentionally but maybe blocking participation or almost like blocking inclusion because it's too much involved. Yeah, so I think that's definitely something that I've thought a lot about, and I've tried a few things this year in terms of how to group students and how to pair students up so that the educational assistant can maybe just be there on the side in case, but not have to be like one-on-one with that student all the time. Because yeah, I think that ends up being a barrier, which is usually unintentional, but
Hmm.
um, yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
definitely it can happen. I know with my son, we would always say to his educational assistant, to his support, that they're the pathway to access of everything in the classroom, but that the teacher is like that. We always emphasize that connection with your teacher and your peers. Like that's why you're there, right? So
Hmm.
yeah, definitely a good point there. So I often hear teachers share there's no support, only one teacher and 25 students.
Hmm. Yeah, I think I'll kind of get to some of that. And
Mhm.
once again, I'm not saying that like just because I've had some success with strategies, it's not like this is the answer. But um, anyways, I think there'll be some things coming up. So I won't. Maybe I'll just save a comment on that
Yeah, sure.
for
And
that.
I'll just read the others. They're not really questions, they are comments. So I'll share them so we can all think about them and then move on. So
Sure.
I'm not a teacher, but I believe this is common. Often students with disabilities are discouraged from being in clubs as there's no support. So rather than connecting to a club that they love and having everyone support everyone, the staff might believe that you can't be a part without support, and many families believe this too. And then executive functioning needs to be in the students I support often to have a big impact on how they're able to participate in their learning environment. And then there was one more comment. Um, Somebody said that when there's more interaction with the EA than teachers, so that's coming up again, and students get taken out of class and they miss activities. Oh gosh, and then there's more in the chat. So I think we'll continue on, and
Okay. Yeah.
yeah, I'll look through the chat
Oh,
and see if there's any questions as well, and then we can maybe share them at the end if
okay.
we have time. But
Okay. I
otherwise,
love these. Thank you so much for your
yeah, it's
comments. Like
great.
this is awesome, and this is the
Yeah.
stuff, yeah, that teachers are grappling with every day, myself included. So I really appreciate this. Okay, I'll carry on here. Um, okay. Sorry, I just have to click in the right spot. There we go. So, in the school board, excuse me, where I currently teach, most special classrooms for students with disabilities have actually been shuttered in the past couple of years in favor of a kind of what it's hard to say exactly is like half inclusion, half withdrawal model. And this really does vary from school to school. There's not a lot of consistency, unfortunately. But essentially, there still is in many schools a resource teacher responsible for students with disabilities, but there's not a physical classroom necessarily. In some cases, the resource teacher works with classroom teachers to think about how to best implement inclusive practices for a student. But in other cases, the resource room acts as a withdrawal classroom where students with disabilities can spend certain periods of the day, ideally in maybe small group learning. Some students, however, end up attending the classroom as a way to offer a break to their peers and teachers in the regular classroom. Not saying this is a right or wrong, just seems to be the reality sometimes. And still, other students attend this resource room, as a means for themselves to have a break from an environment that they might find overwhelming for a variety of reasons. So, many of the ideas I speak about here, that I'll speak about, come from SRV, but I believe they have widespread application throughout the education sector. So I'll try as much as I can in my presentation to use plain language. But if there's any confusion or questions around social role valorization concepts, phrases, or ideas, I'll do my best to clarify, maybe a bit throughout and, of course, after the presentation as well. And I also want to note there's a bunch, I've used names because I think it's just easier to relate, but the names are 100% changed. And so students will not be easily identifiable. Okay, so where do students belong? So SRV talks about image communicators. In other words, what are the ways that someone's image in the eyes of others is communicated? So, for example, do the non-disabled students in your class truly see the student with a disability as inhabiting the student role in the same way that they do? So, setting, I think, is really important here. For example, when you see a child in a classroom, that's a cue. You assume they are a student. And the more time a student is seen in a classroom, with their classmates, the more they are thought of as as regular students going about their day. Inversely, the more time that students with disabilities spend outside the regular classroom, the more likely it is that their classmates, the general student body, and other teachers and professionals in the school will see them as different, as not quite like all the other students. It's not quite like me, perhaps. So, what is one way to ensure that students with disabilities inhabit the valued student role? It's to help them spend as much of their day as possible in the regular classroom. It might seem like that might seem like a no-brainer, but as regular classroom teachers know, there's often pressure to have students with disabilities placed in special needs classrooms or spend large parts of their day in like kind of withdrawal or resource rooms. So if your student is being withdrawn for support, I think it is extremely important to ask what the cost or the benefit is to having them leave the class. I'm just going to repeat that because that's one of the most important points in my presentation. If your student is being withdrawn for support, it is important to ask yourself every day, what is the cost or benefit to having them leave the class? Is the student, when they're being withdrawn, receiving rigorous academic support? Or is there another reason your student is attending like a resource kind of room? One that does not necessarily, a reason that does not necessarily increase their potential for growth. Teachers need to ask themselves, is the risk to inclusion incurred by the student when they leave the classroom, is it mitigated by the benefits the withdrawal support provides? Because I think I'm going to tell a story here, and I think the story highlights the importance of conducting a cost-benefit analysis when allowing students to be withdrawn from your classroom. So this is an experience I have. And I think it illustrates the tension that often accompanies a real push for inclusion in schools. So a student I worked with previously, Mohammed, was a refugee who started school in junior kindergarten with a variety of impairments that needed to be addressed. So he had physical disabilities that meant he had not yet learned to walk. He had a hearing impairment that had not been addressed, which inhibited his ability to acquire language and greatly inhibited his ability to read and write and so on. So he was quite behind academically. And by the time Mohammed reached grade 1, he had made some good progress physically and like with his oral language and was beginning to learn academically sometimes alongside his peers. Especially important was that he was using hearing aids during the grade 1 year. However, he spent major parts of his day withdrawn from the regular classroom, spending time in the school resource room. So, at the beginning of the school year, I continued the arrangement with the resource teacher, and Mohammed was withdrawn to the resource room several times a day. One of the things that can be troubling, and I think that's where obviously communication is key, but it was hard to observe what was going on during these times. I was teaching the other students while he was withdrawn from the room. So after speaking with teachers and other staff members who observed Muhammad in the room, I began to understand that the work he completed was of a non-challenging manner. So I questioned the purpose of pulling him each day if academic goals were not the main reason he was being pulled. Because that to me would have, in the cost benefit analysis, then I think the academic goals, if they were intensive, then I think they would have maybe overwhelmed some of the other risks I'll talk about. Um, but I was met with some resistance when I kind of talked about like I want to bring him back. I want to have him in the class full time. And he was like they kind of saw him as one of their students in this room, and he was such a great kid to work with. So I understood why teachers would want to work with him, right? He was friendly and warm and receptive to instruction. However, rigorous academic instruction was not what he was getting. So I thought there was a cost, kind of a risk to him being withdrawn. I pointed out that parts of the day that he was missing, the parts of the day that he was missing that provided opportunities for inclusion. Like our class poetry recital, and we singing songs together in primary. Going to gym class, all those kind of times for bonding. So I think the story just illustrates that standing up for inclusion for your students with disabilities is not always easy, and there's those tensions there. But I had to insist that he was better off staying in his regular classroom full time. And that caused some friction with other staff members. So I think even if there's a good academic argument for withdrawal, teachers have to be honest with themselves about what the trade-off is, image and role-wise, for the student in question. Is that going to hurt the student's image in the eyes of the other students in the class? Are they going to see him or her like less like a regular student in the room, or less part, not as much as part of the classroom community, if they're being withdrawn? So we need to ask ourselves, is this student being withdrawn? Is it helpful for the student, or is it more about giving me a break or a release of responsibility to the student? And so whether it is the former or the latter, what is the cost to the student in terms of their ability to inhabit the student role in the eyes of their peers, especially the peers, their classmates? So to recap, I think the most important step is that students with disabilities need to be in the regular classroom as much as possible. And sometimes this means tough decisions for teachers and potential conflict with colleagues. So I think when students do spend time, and the majority or all their time, in the regular classroom, students with disabilities, then another SRV concept, that of interpersonal identification, begins to take shape. So for a student with a disability who is at risk of potentially being seen as devalued, interpersonal identification is an integral step to establishing valued roles for them, especially important school-based roles such as student, friend, teammate, and so on. So there's a lengthy definition of interpersonal identification. I'm going to dive in. So interpersonal identification means that one person sees another as being like him or herself, as having things in common. Perhaps the person even sees him or herself in the other. The more people identify with each other, the more they are likely to want to do good things. But sorry, sorry, let me read that again. It's a lengthy definition, like I said. The more people identify with each other, the more they are likely to want good things to happen to each other, and the more they are likely to do or provide good things to each other. The less people identify with each other, so the inverse here, the less likely they are to want to do good things for and to each other. And they are certainly less likely to go out of their way to be and do good things to others. So, in other words, if a student's peers don't see themselves in the student, they have to see themselves in the student with a disability. And if they don't identify with them like that, they are less likely to accept them as part of the larger group and do things for them and with them. So in previous school years, Muhammad was often engaged in activities or was treated in a manner that I would argue blocked this really important interpersonal identification between him and his peers. For example, he crawled around the kindergarten classroom as he had yet to learn to walk, while most of his peers were walking. He was pulled around the school in a wagon, like often an infant is pulled around in a wagon. He played with babyish looking toys while the other students were giving real academic work. And he spent large chunks of the day working in the hallway or the resource room, part of this withdrawal. And because of this, he missed those classroom bonding activities, singing and poetry and gym, and all those things. So I realized at the beginning of my school year with Mohammed that I needed to work towards building interpersonal identification between him and his peers so that he would more likely be seen in the student role. He needed to be seen in a positive light by his peers. Ideally, he would be seen in the student role by them. And this would in turn lead to positive interactions with his peers, which would in turn lead to him seeing himself in the student role. So, how did I go about this? So one thing I did was when we were engaged in learning activities as a full group, he joined the rest of the students at the carpet. And it took him a bit longer to get around because of his physical disabilities. So like we just had to build in that waiting time. Like we weren't going to start anything if he wasn't there. And his seat in the classroom was part of a group of desks of regular students. He did not sit in a special spot for students with disabilities. And I ensured he was present for those classroom bonding activities like gym and music and drama. And the class, we do a poem every week in my class. I've done that for the past couple of years. So that was a big thing for him to be part of that poem. So I think having Muhammad join the whole group for learning had several benefits. Like first, from an academic perspective, he became more immersed in the learning. He was physically present for it. And secondly, from an SRV perspective, he was seen by his peers and other teachers who worked with him as fulfilling the student role. Because of this, he became more relatable to them, and they were more likely to want to work with him. For example, to partner up for a project or to choose him as a playmate at recess. Muhammad's physical presence was also very important for the rest of the students. He needed to be perceived to be in the student role by his peers for them to begin treating him as such. There's a few other subtle examples of how I promoted the student role that like just anyone walking in my classroom wouldn't have necessarily recognized right away, but that I think the students themselves intuitively like kind of understood. So, for example, in math, I used a curriculum kit that provided various practice games in addition and subtraction. And so Muhammad was not working at the same academic level as the majority of his classmates, but I had him play games from the same kit. So they kind of all had the same look. You'd have to really go up really close and have a look to see. So teaming him up, and I would team him up with a strong student who could miss practicing the main skill sometimes, without falling behind. So, like from a distance, these games look quite similar and they look kind of age appropriate. They weren't like kindergarten looking games. So even though, right, these games weren't at the same level, they didn't look childish and they didn't image him in that kind of childish light. They kind of made him look like everyone else in there. In literacy, I matched each student in my class with a peer reading partner. So this is someone who's usually just a little bit above or below the student in skill, so as to facilitate like some the best reading practice. But Muhammad, there wasn't really anyone kind of near his reading level. He was like pre-reading and just learning the sounds. So I matched him but I did match him with a reading partner. So I'll explain. So because Muhammad did not acquire hearing aids until he was in grade one, his speech and language were significantly delayed. And his parents, they spoke a language other than English at home. So he needed to hear as much language as possible to immerse himself in the language. So while he wasn't really working on the same skill as other students, phonetic decoding and fluency in their reading, he was working on an important skill for him. So by listening to someone read, um, that was really important for him. And it was a very similar looking activity, especially in the eyes of the other students. He had a reading partner too, and he was going about that with them. So I think this kind of class participation increased the likelihood of interpersonal identification, that the other students were going to see Muhammad as being like them. And while Muhammad was being read to, just back to the comment about the educational assistant, they didn't need to be part of that interaction. The other student would team up with him, would kind of arrange the desk so everything was ready, and then the other student would begin reading to Muhammad. So yeah, the educational assistant could go and help someone else in the class. So I wouldn't say this kind of interpersonal identification, it doesn't guarantee friendships, but it makes it much more likely that they will occur. And I did observe over time that students, it was kind of cool. They wanted to read with Muhammad, sorry, and eat lunch with Muhammad on a regular basis. So another student of mine with autism faced similar circumstances to Muhammad. Caden was strong academically, but at the beginning of the year, quite isolated socially from the other students in the classroom. So he was yet another student who spent time in the resource room in previous years. And I considered how this might have benefited him or in other ways held him back. So I think, he'd been getting a lot of social stories, and kind of that kind of social preparation in the resource room. But I believe, nothing prepares a student more for social interactions than real life practice. So once again, I had to ask myself, what is the cost to Caden's image? What was the cost to Caden's image to him being perceived in the student role by his peers in the regular classroom if he continued to attend the resource room? So I began the school year by encouraging Caden to be an active participant in learning activities. In the previous school year, he had refused to sit with the full group, and the teacher just kind of let this go. But I was like, no, this is my hill to die on. He's gonna be with us. Because otherwise he was just partly always kind of on the outside. And that once again led to him being seen as an outsider. So I used gentle but firm encouragement. It was the expectation that he join us for learning each day, even if he did not always meet my expectations in the beginning. It was there. So in my classroom, students gathered at the front of the room on a large carpet. So at the beginning of the school year, Caden refused to join and stayed seated at his desk. So I gave him some time there, but after a week or so, I convinced him to move his chair closer to the back of the seating area. As the school year progressed, I slowly convinced him to move his chair closer. Next, I convinced him to leave the chair and try sitting closer to the group, but still not on the carpet, on the floor. And then finally, he was offered a spot sitting near the front, just off the edge of the carpet area. And then slowly, I convinced him to move to the edge of the carpet, enticing him with a soft cushion. So it took about like 6 weeks or so, but eventually he was sitting with the group on the carpet full time. So once again, convincing Caden to join the whole group for learning had several benefits. From an academic perspective, he became more immersed in the learning. He was physically present for it. And secondly, he was seen by his peers and the other teachers who worked with him as fulfilling the student role. Because of this, he became more relatable to him, and they were more likely to want to work with him. If he was physically present at the carpet, if I said like, okay, it's time for a turn and talk to your peers about this concept, then he was there. Even if he wasn't always the one doing the speaking, he was there as someone who was listening, someone who could be engaged with. And so people were more likely to want to be willing to partner up with him for a project or to choose him as a playmate at recess. So I think he needed to be perceived to be in the student role to then be treated as a student, as a fellow student and a friend by his peers. I also worked really hard to tap into Caden's interests and use these as a catalyst for our classroom learning. So before the school year began, I spoke to Caden's parents about his hobbies, and things he liked to do in his spare time. He loved cooking. So our first poetry unit, we read food poems and wrote poetry about pizza and our favorite foods. We went apple picking and made applesauce. As well, Caden was fascinated by millipedes, so our first science unit of the year began with an exploration of millipede habitats. I found millipedes on the schoolyard and we investigated their behavior along with other insects. I didn't love that, but I did it for him. We created millipede designs in art. There were a lot of millipedes. This strategy had two purposes regarding interpersonal identification. Firstly, it communicated to Caden that I was similar to him, that I held similar interests, and therefore it strengthened interpersonal identification between us. Secondly, it communicated to the other students in the class that Caden, not only was he like me, but he had similar interests to them. Cooking and food are popular with many students. Everyone found millipedes and insects in general fascinating. The students began to see Caden as having similar interests, as being similar to them generally. Therefore, it strengthened interpersonal identification between them. Finally, it also grabbed Caden's attention. Seeing his interests represented in the learning material helped him to more easily assume the student role. And this happened unconsciously without him being aware, I think, that he was doing so. So that brings me to the next discussion question, which is, what everyday classroom practices do you engage in that might strengthen interpersonal identification between students?
Thank you, Stephen. So if people
Yeah.
just want to share, I'll read as many comments as I can, and otherwise just have a little think because there are lots of examples. It's just these are two really great concrete examples of this, the ones you've just shared.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. And what I like is it kind of puts language to something that we're aware of, right? Like if I have a student who's left out of circle, I'm aware they're left out. This helps give language to that and maybe in doing so have a solution. So,
Hmm. Hmm. I see a comment here. Can I read the comment, Andrea?
oh yeah. Oh, there.
Yes.
I don't see it.
Well, there's one. I think there's one that we didn't read from
Oh
earlier.
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I think it says, I don't think it is solely the responsibility of the teacher to create an inclusive class. They are the person that can model to the students, to the student, I'd probably mean students or as well, how to be inclusive so that students can take a role in inclusion. And I think for me, like that's been huge. Like I've just been, like it's inclusive because the other students are like deeply involved in that inclusive process. Like I think, it's not just me saying like, oh, I'm always including the student. It's like in everything that we do, that student is just like a fluid part of how things work and how things run in the classroom. They have a job to clean up at the end of the day. They have all the helper roles. They sit amongst all the other students. They're paired up constantly with the other students. Um, so it ends up being almost kind of student led, like it is encouraged by the teacher, but it ends up being student led as well.
That's when it's really powerful, eh? When the students
Hmm.
take on that role. And so the next comment is to say use examples of things for learning that most students are interested in. And then somebody else has said, to ask, how do we feel about yesterday's lesson? Oh, promoting we language. But the precursor to that is creating a safe place to share.
Space Fisher. Okay, yeah. Hmm. For sure.
So I think that's it for now. I'll just double check I didn't miss because we've got two spots. Yeah,
Okay.
that's all the comments for now.
Okay. I'm gonna move on. Okay,
Thanks,
thank you. Yeah,
everybody.
thanks again. Yes, it's awesome. There's a lot more to think about there too. Thank you. So as I stated previously, um, Wolfensberger noted that Wolfensberger from SRV, he noted that when people identify with others, they will try to please those they are identifying with, and they will try to do what others ask of them. So in this case, part of Caden buying into the student role was him responding positively to me as his teacher. So to not only have him go along with what I ask of him, but to have him look to me for praise and for direction. So as Caden settled into his daily routine and became more involved in classroom learning, I began to pull him regularly for extra mathematics support. And due to Caden's social and academic isolation in years previous, and despite his strong academic ability, he was significantly behind just because of a lot of his non-participation. But he surprised me with how hard he worked during the sessions. I think despite the self-awareness of how far behind the other students he was dedicated to improving his skills. I think part of that was that interpersonal identification that he wanted to demonstrate to me each day what he was capable of. And next, I'll discuss another form of interpersonal identification, and that between teachers and parents. So, oh, I think, did I go ahead? Sorry, I went ahead there. So, public schools, very much a modern bureaucracy, do not always feel like open and welcoming spaces. Doors are locked, visitors are screened. And once again, there might be good reasons for this, but it's just how does that make how does that make parents feel, or what does that mean for access to the space? Parents need a police check to volunteer in their child's classroom. I think parents of disabled children have often had negative experiences with school officials and teachers, especially as they have had to be such passionate advocates throughout their child's lives to ensure they receive the support they need to flourish. And I think because of this, parents of children with disabilities often get stereotyped as being pushy or difficult. Um, having worked personally in both developmental services field and education, I have an understanding of the struggles of parents of children with disabilities, and I hope this has given me more empathy for the mindset that many parents have. Because, sometimes, like if you have a nonverbal child in your class, how are you going to build classroom lessons and things around them if you can't really necessarily learn from them what some of their hobbies or some of their interests are? So I think really getting in touch and remaining in touch with parents of children with disabilities is actually a huge asset for inclusion. How have I used interpersonal identification with parents? When introducing myself in September, I let it be known that I'm a parent and that my children attend the same school as their children. Just to say I'm a parent just like you. And throughout the year, I invite parents to volunteer in the classroom as helpers, as readers, I invite parents to accompany the class on field trips and community walks. I also hold several classroom events throughout the year, a winter holiday party, a spring solstice party, like an end of year celebration. The idea is to host the parents in the classroom setting, hopefully giving them a sense of the daily routine for myself and the students. And I try to speak with parents regularly about the contributions their children make to the classroom. And I speak honestly about the challenges that I'm facing in terms of inclusion. I want parents to know that I walk alongside them in their struggle for equality for their child. That I'm an ally in striving for inclusion for their child. Okay, so I'm going to turn a little bit here. So far I've talked about ways to promote inclusion for devalued students, but next I want to turn my attention towards some potential barriers to inclusion. Some of this can be pretty nuanced, and I think there can be many barriers along the way, along that journey to inclusion. So once again, I'm going to return to the idea of the cost-benefit analysis. In other words, what is the payoff for using a specific strategy or device or teaching tool and so on? I've found that often on the outset, what seemed like a great idea in terms of promoting student growth or learning actually worked against the idea of inclusion. So this is where, once again, I feel like my training in social role valorization has really been a guide for me on how to respond to those unanticipated scenarios that actually occur daily in the public school setting. In a public school, there are various other professionals aside from the classroom teacher that exert influence over the way the classroom is run and the response to various students. So SRV has been helpful at times when I've had to think on my feet and make decisions and judgments quickly. There have been many instances in my career when my gut has told me that the response being considered or used was incorrect. So even though it was maybe coming from like an expert in special education or something like that within the school board, it just kind of felt like, this is actually my gut's telling me this somehow violates, principles of inclusion. So, and more often than not, it's because it's violated an SRV principle and failed to promote inclusion really in the end. So here's another story, an example of this. A recent student I taught a couple of years ago in grade 3, Adam, had diagnoses of autism and ADHD. But, these diagnoses aside, he had an extremely difficult time concentrating on the lessons being taught. And I'm sure if anyone, especially teaching in elementary, but probably in high school too, you have students like this in your class. They're just like really struggling with their attention. So despite being physically present for the lesson and having a beginning foundation of academic skills, he was often returned to he often would go back to his seat for follow-up work with like no idea of what the instructions were. And then he required that one-to-one support to complete an assignment. And he wouldn't, be able to complete a group assignment because he wouldn't know what to do. So that kind of inhibited his working with other students. So once again, like kind of working against inclusion. And I tried a few strategies that didn't work, to Adam's advantage. I tried giving him a spot near the front or center of the carpet area. I tried giving him a wiggle cushion. You've seen these, a special cushion filled with air that some students have that allows them to move around a bit while hopefully still focusing on the lesson. And lastly, I tried having him sit in a chair actually next to the carpet area. When he sat down on the floor, he had trouble getting comfortable and he'd often flop his head forward, so he wasn't even looking towards me or the board. And I thought having him sit in a chair would put him in my sight line more readily, allowing me to remind him to sit up straight at regular intervals. Finally, I made sure to engage Adam with regular questions about the content we were covering. So I tried to like really engage him throughout a lesson. Still on most days, he was struggling with his attention and had those problems that I mentioned. So the school administration thought it would be beneficial if we invited an autism specialist that worked for the school board to observe Adam and hopefully give us some recommendations on instructional strategies we could use. After observing Adam, the autism specialist determined that Adam often didn't know where to focus his attention in the first place. Like he wasn't even sure on where to look and where to focus his energy. As well, he was easily distracted by any outside stimuli and would need constant reminders to refocus. Keep your eyes this way, this way. So he left me with 2 suggestions that he thought would assist Adam. So firstly, he gave me 4 laminated posters that I could put on the board facing all the students. These served as reminders for all students on what their job was when sitting at the carpet. Stop talking, sit up straight, look straight ahead at the teacher, listen to what the teacher is saying. Things you probably go through all day with your students. So I thought the posters were a good idea. I could review them before the start of a lesson with the whole class, not kind of like pointing out Adam, and revisit them as necessary throughout a lesson, considering both Adam's and the whole class's focus level, but never having to highlight the fact, like I said, that they're specifically for Adam. Secondly, and what the autism specialist was most excited about was a winter hat for Adam with a flashlight embedded in it. I had noticed that these hats were popular the previous winter. The idea was that this light would point out what was important for Adam to focus on, and he would follow the light with his eyes. So it looks like this. You've probably seen these around. They were popular a couple of Christmases ago. But immediately bells started to go off. I'd already felt like I'd compromised on Adam's image with some of the other strategies I tried with him, including the wiggle cushion and having him sit in a chair. These strategies already communicated to the students that Adam was different from the rest of the class. So I immediately thought also of several practical limitations. Firstly, it would likely feel warm and uncomfortable for Adam to wear a winter hat inside during the school day. Second, it would be distracting for me and the other students to have a light following my movements at the front of the classroom, especially if the light was shining in my eyes. So I totally understood the intent of the autism specialist. Adam needed to focus his attention, and he needed to do so, ultimately independently. So while they appreciated the first part of his plan, he could see that I was not so keen on the second part, the flashlight hat. And maybe he thought it was something to do with the light, because before I could illuminate my concerns, the specialist pulled another hat out of his bag made from construction paper. Adam and I made this together, he said. It's a paper model of the winter hat. He could use this instead. I told him he could focus his imaginary laser beam on the teacher during lessons. As I stated, I understood the autism specialist's intent to help Adam to focus his attention. But like my gut was telling me something was off here. Alarm bells were going off in my head. I just felt like in this instance, the damage to his image and therefore ultimately to inclusion, this is like a barrier to interpersonal identification if the kids, think like they already think something is different about Adam, based on some of the things I'd already done. So I'd already done a cost benefit analysis and thought some of the things I'm doing are worth it for Adam academically, but I did know that there was a cost to what I was doing socially and therefore to inclusion, for Adam. But like this, I just felt like this paper hat especially would just be a step too far. Wearing a cardboard hat in grade 3 that no one else would be wearing would enhance his differences and invite ridicule. So I thanked the autism specialist for his suggestion, but once he left, I swiftly hid the hats out of sight from Adam, lest he get any ideas about using them. So once again, I think the intent was to help, and it can be so hard sometimes when that help is coming from professionals who maybe even have like more senior position than you, with the school board that you're working for. You kind of feel like, well, those people are the experts, so maybe what my gut is telling me isn't, maybe I should go with what they're saying. But I think sometimes you have to kind of, your classroom best, and the kind of social kind of atmosphere in your classroom, and the standing of your students with each other. So, like, the intent was to help, but I think the unintended consequences, actually the cost of helping Adam in this way, would ultimately do him more damage in the long term. So, thinking about whether a strategy, a game, an activity, and so on, ends up causing more or less harm to the image of a student with a disability in the eyes of their peers is related to a concept from SRV, from social role valorization, known as the conservatism corollary. Now, it has nothing to do with politics. I know the word conservatism is in there, but just so another Wolfensberger loved long definitions. So here's another one from SRV. The conservatism corollary means avoiding putting further hardships, wounding, or devaluation on a party that is already devalued, wounded, or at risk thereof, and instead bending over backward or going the extra mile to apply preventative or remedial measures, perhaps even doing the best that is possible, rather than something that is merely good. So I think part of this concept of the conservatism corollary is recognizing that your students with disabilities are like, they are vulnerable and they're more at risk to, to not being included, to not having friends. They're more at risk for all sorts of like social things like that, and academic risks. And so that like really you need to bend over backwards, you need to go the extra mile for them. And that's kind of what this conservatism corollary implies. So Adam's multiple impairments, they already put him at a disadvantage when compared to the other students. So while the winter hat with a light on it, it might have been fine for him to wear outside in the schoolyard, wearing it in the classroom, on the other hand, and having him use it during whole group lessons would have unnecessarily exaggerated the issues he was having and would have given the students the idea that, like, geez, something really is different or odd about Adam. And the paper hat, that was obviously a step too far as well. it gave Adam a clownish appearance. And like I said, probably would have opened him up to ridicule. So training, I think, in SRV here for me and knowledge of this conservatism corollary just allowed me to do a quick analysis of the potential benefit or adaptive strategies for Adam on one hand versus the potential image damage on the other. And in this case, I could say like the image damage impact seemed too risky to move ahead with the suggestion. So, but I try to have an open mind about potential adaptations for students with disabilities while remaining skeptical of their purported benefits. I need to be certain that the benefit of a support or an adaptation would, lean towards inclusion and outweigh the potential damaging effects in terms of a student's participation in the regular classroom. So here's another example of this. An occupational therapist ordered a specially adapted tricycle for Mohammed, the student I spoke of earlier, that they felt he could use in gym during physical education instruction. So the tricycle was very large and had many straps to ensure that Mohammed wouldn't fall out of it. So it looks like this. I'm sure you've seen them around. You may have seen them around in schools or in services for people with disabilities. But during gym class that year, I had 20 students in total. It was when the educational assistant went on their break. So I was alone with 20 students, including students with disabilities. And one of my main goals, probably the most main goal, other than physical education instruction, was thinking about how to include the students with disabilities, including Mohammed, in each game we played, and whether that, in soccer and hockey and dodgeball. So once again, upon first seeing the tricycle, alarm bells went off. From just a practical perspective, like helping Mohammed to use this tricycle would have been tricky considering I had 19 other students that I also had to supervise. And secondly, and I think more importantly related to inclusion, is, I also believe that it would have acted as a potential barrier to inclusion for taking away the focus from how to best plan an inclusive gym class and instead focusing on doing something special with Mohammed. I think, with arguably the same physical benefit as if he just participated in the regular gym class. So while this is I've seen something like this before and thought, oh, this is exciting. This is something really neat for a student to use. But then I think, it's going to set him apart from everyone else. No one else in the classroom is going to have one of these. It's only this student. So in terms of that kind of participation, it just makes it a bit more difficult. And when we've got other games we're running that he could participate in, it seems like that is the more, the better option for inclusion. So I've found often throughout my career that students with disabilities are often tools and technology, but not like real in-class support that would actually assist with inclusion. Yeah. So that brings me to my next discussion question. I wonder if you've ever felt uneasy about a recommended strategy, but maybe struggled to articulate why. Or maybe you can give an example of a strategy if you like, or just, yeah.
Thanks, Stephen. I wrote that down, given tools and technology, but not often the actual human inclusion piece. And
Hmm.
yeah, and again, say with the bike, of course there could be benefits to riding a bike. It's just the timing. It's the timing, the
Hmm.
place, the image as well. So it's an interesting example.
Hmm. Yeah, and it makes me, it's, because sometimes you feel like, oh, I don't want to be the person always saying no, or I don't want to be the person who's like a downer about something that, yeah, I get why, like other people would be excited about that for Muhammad, for example. But then I'm thinking about, this is not something that the school would want the other students to use, considering how expensive it is, and so, yeah,
Well,
yeah.
what stood out to me is that he was successfully included in class already
Hmm. Hmm.
into the phys ed class. And so if that had been a major obstacle to figure out something, but it was already happening. So why
Yeah.
undo it? Yeah. So very interesting example there. So I'm just checking. Oh, we don't have any new comments yet. All of our teachers are tired.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
So
only Tuesday. Sorry.
I know, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think given that it's almost 7, we can leave
Okay.
everyone with that. Oh, we got one more. Sometimes a strategy will help the person, but it's not inclusive.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
The
then I
interesting
think that cost
balance.
benefit analysis it really
Hmm.
comes in there because sometimes you're like, you know what? No, actually, this person whatever the adaptive strategy is, they actually do really need this, and I need to like sacrifice a bit of maybe my inclusion principles to make that happen for the student. So I think that's why I just need to be like really like, okay, is it going to be the most important thing right now? Or, is the risk to inclusion too great at this moment kind of thing too?
Yeah, and it reminds me as well of person-centered planning when you have your vision or your goal and you have to pick like what's going to take you off the path and what's going to keep you with limited time, limited
Hmm.
opportunity. Yeah. Okay, we have one more. Oh, that is in the Q&A. Sorry. What can be done when other staff or professionals do not understand devaluing? That is a great question.
Hmm.
And so maybe we can end with like I don't know if you're at the end of your slides there or not, or if we want to end with
Yeah.
that last question. Kind of does sum it up when people don't understand it. And like you said,
Yeah.
feel terrible criticizing someone's good intention, but
I know, and I think that's the thing. I think if you can just, I think where I've been successful is, to say, hey, like, come and observe my class and see how inclusive it is. I think, you know what I mean? If you can basically lead with your behavior and say, I know like I'm disagreeing with you on this, but see that my intentions for the students are really all about like promoting inclusion. I think that has kind of sometimes helped me kind of win people over and
right,
go, okay, like, I'll let you do your thing because even though we're disagreeing on this issue, I respect overall what you're doing.
right. Okay. I think we have so many good comments tonight, and so I really
Thanks
appreciate
everyone.
that,
Yeah.
everybody. And I think we'll wrap it up now, given that it is 7.
Okay.
And we have some thank yous coming up in the chat. People really enjoying the examples, and thank you so much. And
Yeah,
on
absolutely.
behalf of Inclusive Education Canada and Inclusive Canada, Inclusion Canada, I'd like to thank you, Stephen, for taking the time tonight to share all of this with us and
Mhm.
very thought-provoking for educators and people interested in education. So your time and your thoughtfulness is really appreciated.
All right. Thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah. I'm happy to talk about this anytime. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Oh, have calls to get more teachers to another one. There you go.
Okay. Awesome.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks everybody for coming tonight and have a good night. And yeah, we will maybe again, we'll have to do some more of this sort of thing. So it seems to be well received. So thanks everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Thanks.